How to mix pop-punk drums to sound like this. And just quickly, if you make music like this and you want me to mix your next song, then head over to my website, terrybeckleyrecording.com, scroll to the bottom and fill out the contact form. I will get back to you. The challenge with drums like these is to get them hitting, but without having the kick and snare like stick out. We need the drums to sound like a cohesive kit and not a collection of different drum samples stuck together. And we definitely don't want these drums to sound like a metal kit and therefore not in keeping with the pop punk and emo genre. I did choose these drum sounds carefully, and if you want to see the method behind that, then I've linked to that video in the description. So let's look at the mix. And because we've chosen our drum samples properly, hopefully you'll see from the lack of plugins here that I'm not over mixing this. So let's start with kick drum here. So I'll quickly run through what these samples are. But again, if you want to see it in depth, check out the previous video. This kick in is GGD Modern and Massive. This kick trigger track is Trigger 2 from Slate, and it's triggering off that same Modern and Massive kick track. And it is a one shot that I stole from a Dragged Under session, and so far have got away with. And then this DF kick is Drumforge kick, which is the Drumforge Ultimate plugin. Quick run through of how they sound. Modern and Massive by itself. Add in the triggered one shot. Bit of room and click in there, and then add in the Drumforge kick. Which is where that modern polished kick drum sound is coming from. And the idea is I'm blending it in with some more natural sounding kicks to get the best of both. As you can see, if you look at the channel strip there, there's no plugins. I'm doing the mixing on the kick bus because I'm trying to treat this as one kick sound that's just quite textured. Hence why I think it's so important to pick your samples with the end in mind like that. If I was to turn these plugins off on the kick bus, it still sounds pretty good. Switch them back on. You know, I've sharpened them up a little bit. I've got them hitting a bit harder, but it's not that different, right? So first plugin is the FG Stress from Slate Digital, a distressor plugin. And I'm, really not pushing it in that much, although the gain reduction is showing a fair bit. I've slowed the attack down to get some attack out of it, to get some transient out of it. And I've quickened the release up to make sure it's hitting fast. 4:1 ratio. These two aren't doing anything, they're just part of my default chain here. So off and on, which I'll show you now, we're talking subtle changes. So this is it bypassed. Yeah, so hopefully when you saw the lights on the gain reduction meter light up, you could tell that was on. It really tightens up the bottom end of it. It stops it from dragging into the next kick hit, and it gives it a bit of like punch. But it really isn't that drastic, but it's really important because I want that low end to be tight. Show you again. Yeah, I mean, that's all that's doing is tightening that kick up and giving it a bit of hit, but it's cool and it's definitely important. Okay, next we've got some EQ. And this here just shows I have a personal vendetta against these frequencies in the kick drum. They're actually let loose in a lot of pop punk. I just don't like them. It sounds chirpy to me. So you wouldn't need to do this unless you agree with me. Let me show you what it's taken out. I'll boost this here. See, not that bothersome, but to me, the more I hear it and the more when I put the guitars in and stuff, I can just hear this little chirpiness going on. And to me, it conflicts with the top end of the guitars. I just don't like it. And then this one here, higher up at 5K. It's just a bit abrasive to me. I don't like it. Not a problem to leave it in. And now, so that was my cutting EQ. And this is now how I shape the sound with a boosting EQ. So SSL channel from Waves. Got the filters engaged here. 45 Hertz and below is being filtered out. These are very gentle slopes. But that's where I feel like the flubbiness of the kick that's going to affect the mastering chain and stuff is probably going to be where the problems are. And then I'm rolling off everything above 10K because to me, I don't need that kind of presence in the kick. That's like a metal thing where you would sort of boost it, 6 to 8K, something like that. I don't need all that. And because I've done that, I can boost just under a decibel, literally 0.8 of a decibel at 6K or 6.5. That's for the top end presence of the kick. Or the click, if you like. And then some of the bite of the kick here, which is probably one of the more drastic ones, 3 decibels, 4.5. If this was a live kick that you recorded with a mic, this would be way more drastic, but these are samples, they already sound good. One of the things I always used to do, which would mess up my drum mixes, is over EQ these samples. So 4.5K, bit of bite there. And then a bit of the sort of like mid-range punch of the kick, 3.5 decibels, between 1 and 1.5K. And the bottom of the kick, pushing just under 3 decibels of 65 hertz, which is sort of where the meat of it is. I don't want to say fundamental, because technically I'm sure people will jump all over my ass about that not being correct. But it's sort of the meat, where you feel it without listening on a sub or headphones. That's sort of where I feel it in my speakers. So I think with kicks, you have these two questions that you need to answer. How much bottom end do you want to put into it? Remember, you've got the bass to think about, you've got bus compressors and mastering limiters to think about, but you also need to make sure the kick is balanced with the top end. And then the other question is, how much top end, how much click? And you need them to be, neither one of them can be outweighing the other one. But I think what's super important, and it's why I mix a certain way, is that that top end fits with the guitars. So I don't mix drums first. I would get my guitar tone first and then try and match these boosts in the 6K, 4.5K range so that it feels right with the tone. You know, if you were mixing back in the day, you'd have the guitar tone already, wouldn't you? Because it would have been recorded. It's not like it would have been a DI you were listening to. You would have had the rough tone rather than having to, you know, the choice of swapping it out later with different amp sims. So I'll show you the kick and then I'll show you it with the guitar, so hopefully you get an idea of what I'm talking about. So let's turn this EQ off and you can hear all those boosts at once and work out what they're doing, and then I'll go through each one. Yeah, it sharpens the sound up, right? It's a little dull. I've just sharpened it up with some precise boosts. I haven't changed the character of the sound. I'm not trying to reshape this. Maybe you would if you had like a boxy live kick. You'd probably want to cut some boxiness and tighten that up with EQ. So each one, and I'll flick each one of these knobs on in turn. Yeah, enhancing what's already there in a cool, subtle way. Let me just chuck the rhythm guitars on now. I'm going to bypass the EQ again, and hopefully you can hear that I've chosen those frequencies because they fit well with the tone. Yeah, nothing there is poking out. In fact, when the whole mix is in, obviously, you need that extra bit of bite to this kick. If I was to put the attack in a different place, I'll show you how it sort of falls apart from the guitars. Those, you know, they're not overly gainy guitars, are they? They're not like proper metal guitars where you would need this kind of boost. See, now they sound separate to me. I feel like the kick's doing one thing, the guitars are doing another. And that sort of 8K drastic boost like that is in a lot of presets because I think it's geared towards thicker guitars. That's not really how things go in this kind of like pop punk emo space. So last thing on the kick then is a clipper. We've got so much transient and clippers give you so much energy. They really boost your drums. They just shave off the peaks, but you don't really lose the transient. You know, unless you overdo it, it sounds distorted before it sounds flat like a limiter. And this will really give you some kick. So I'll start with it off and I'll put it on. It's cool. It adds energy, and if you have a clipper like that doesn't affect the EQ balance like other clippers can, I would recommend using it on drums. Okay, moving on to snare. So again, if you look at the channel strips, no plugins. This is a triggered side stick, and we've got a bit of compression happening on that, which I did show in the previous video. Again, treating it as one sound, and because we chose the samples so well, in my opinion, we don't want to mess with that sound. It sounds good already. So this is the snare. And let me show you that one by one. So punk snare, which is actually One Kit Wonder Pop Punk from GGD, my favorite sample snare. And then we add in this side stick here, which sounds like this by itself. But it's so good for attack because those two together. that punches holes through guitars. Like, you hear that. Then we've got this snare 1123, a blend of 2 snares from Drumforge. By themselves, sounds like this. Mid-range punch to go with the nice high-tuned snap of the punk snare and the attack of the side stick all together. And then we've got this snare 10, which is a high-tuned snare. And this gives me top-end crack, because I don't know if you felt when you heard that, you're like, oh, it kind of misses a bit of openness, a bit of brightness. That's what this snare was for. So, all together. Again, all the mixing happening on the snare bus and 4 plugins. So first up, we've got some compression. I'm treating them all as one sound, so I want them all moving in the same way. So 4:1 ratio, slowest attack, fastest release, all transient, all punch. I'll start with it off and I'll turn it on. Yeah, that's how it gets up in your face, because before I think it's sort of just like prancing around, and then you put the compressor on and it gives it direction and it pushes it right at you. It's sort of just having a time, it's relaxed, and then you give it a bit. Yeah, it's cool. Then boosting EQ, very little happening here. I don't even know if this is supposed to be off, but 0.3 of a decibel this time at 8K. 1.5 decibels at 2.5K pretty much. And then an 8 decibel cut with a thin-ish Q, 700 hertz. Boxy, sort of plasticky sound. And then that's your low-end punch here. Your bottom of your snare, your sort of 200 oomph part of it. 5 decibels at 180 hertz. And like the kick, you kind of want to balance the top and the bottom parts of the snare. So off and on. Yeah, tight modern punch. That's what that sounds like to me. So I'll do what I did before, I'll turn them all off, and we'll go one by one, starting with the bottom. Yeah, so hopefully you heard that. We gave it some punch. Then we cleaned that punch up, and it actually accentuated the sort of 180, 200 hertz boost that we're doing by cutting that 700 hertz area. And then we gave it a bit of bite, gave it the tiniest little bit of top end. Next up, clipper like before. So off and on. Just adds that bit of energy to it, gives you a bit more level on the snare. And then as you're mixing, you're probably going to start to feel like once things come in, your snare needs a bit more bite, a bit more opening up. So that's why I've got this mag EQ here. The 2.5K band is really a nice, smooth way of getting 2K into your mixes without it going harsh and having those resonant frequencies. I don't know an EQ that does it better in the box wise. And then 40K air band, and then you bring that air band up until you open it up to a point that you like. That's why I love this EQ. So off and on. Just a tiniest little bit of top end coming in there, but it's smooth. So kick and snare together, we have this. Their punch is very similar, the energy is similar, and that's how you sort of get a kick and snare relationship. The EQ side of things, also you want them to be coherent. Again, if we had a really clicky kick, but the snare was almost sitting less bright than that, it's sort of like a more of a metal thing to do, not really something we want too much of in pop punk. So a little snare verb that we're bussing out to. If you look at these snare tracks, we've got snare verb happening. So I'll bring that in now, but that is just Valhalla Room, medium gated snare, and then I compress it with gain reduction, which is a heavy-handed compressor, and then give it some brightness with this Moog DSP EQ here. This is just a really cool one for brightness, an 8K, just under 8K shelf there. So we have this. Yeah, it's just that gate gives it like a little shove. It sounds kind of weird sometimes on its own, but with all the music in, it just gives a shove to the snare. And then this snare verb, Again, we saw that in the previous video. This is the snare 10 that I've got here. This is the verb that comes with that in the plugin. So that snare verb and the gated snare verb and the snare. Yeah, there we go. Samples can be very dry, and often you'll hear it's got a lot of punch, but it doesn't sound like you hear drums, because you never hear a snare drum without echo and ring after it in a room. These para snare and para kick, they're actually just a dry bus. It basically is just a way of getting around my drum compression that's happening on my drum bus. If I show you, these all route to a drum bus here, which has a 4:1 ratio, slowest attack, fastest release, and that's just making sure the kick and snare is not jumping out. Obviously, everything goes to that, and then we've got a little bit of saturation from the non-linear summer from waves. But that will clamp down on your kick and snare, and it will keep them cohesive with the kit. And then when everything's in, you kind of want a bit of punch. So these basically divert that and go straight to the mastering chain. Sometimes my mix bus, but often just straight out to the mastering chain. I just let them be, and I can dial them in as much as I need them to. So they're obviously they're down really low, like -16, -15.8, so -16 on both. But they just give me an extra bit of transient and kick and snare, so it sounds more modern and it gets through everything. I'll show you the whole mix, and then I'll turn them off and on, and you'll see a dry bus, just extra kick and snare. I'm not processing them in any kind of parallel way. So I'll start with them on, I'll mute them and bring them back. Yeah, it just reminds you that they're there. So that's the bulk of the mixing done. Because we chose the samples, if you look at my toms, not that this is a very tom-driven song, but we have loads of tom tracks. These ones are from GGD. This is a Logic tom. These are the One Kit Wonder pop punk toms. These are the Drumforge toms, and again, another Logic tom to a toms bus. There isn't a single plugin on any of that. Whenever I try to EQ or compress toms, it just doesn't often work. And I feel like I lose, it makes them sound super processed, super sampled, and weird. I feel, when you've got really fast fills happening, they've got to be there. If you EQ the top too much, I feel like you don't often hear toms like that, because you don't often get a clear top end in a tom track. You can gate them cleverly, of course you can, and of course it helps, but that super clean top end of the tom, it's kind of supposed to be messier. That's what we're used to hearing. Again, low end, problem in mastering, and sort of you kind of want it to meld with the kick and bass. So I often just don't touch them. And if this was a more tom heavy song and they were more pronounced, or there was one of those like quick verses where you got the floor tom going, I'd pronounce it a bit more with a little bit of EQ, a little bit of compression, but it wouldn't be much. Because for now, I'm fine with this, because they're not the main feature. And then another fill here. Yeah, they're there, but they're not taken over. But not a single plugin. And if you want to see how that's possible, check out the previous video. Hi-hat just got a bit of soothe. The hi-hat is really nice on Drumforge, and all I really need to do is this harsh hi-hat preset, pretty much. These are the two resonant parts of it, really, the bits that conflict with overheads and vocals and guitar, and that's so subtle you probably won't hear it. The hi-hats in this song can be a bit of a problem too, because they're sort of just going like crazy in the verse, so soothe is kind of important. And then I do bring it up in soothe. That's why there's a bit of a volume jump there. But important, but you wouldn't really notice it unless you start to hear it with the guitars and stuff. You start to hear it get a bit harsh. So the ride, which has some cool parts in the song, more mixing than I've done on anything somehow. That's because I want the right part of the ride to come through. It's the bell part. So bringing it up, soothe, just to make sure it's not harsh, because I want it to be coming out of the drums, but I don't want it to cause any problems and fight with things. And these are the parts of the ride that I wanted to poke through the guitars. If I play it with the mix, we'll see what this EQ is doing here. Yeah, that it gives that weight to the bell, so it's not just like a chinging away in the top end there. It actually gets some almost mid-range terms of cymbals, through. Overheads, these are literally just overhead track for the Logic toms. Sounds awful by itself. But it gives the toms space because you don't want weird isolated toms. And then overheads, nothing on them, which is kind of strange, but they're not harsh in the Drumforge plugin. You could always put a little bit of soothe on there, EQ out a little bit of harshness, but to me, I don't think it felt like it ever needed it. And then on the overheads bus, I've got a little bit of a transient designer, just because I felt like in this song, the sustain was too short. So in between the cymbal hits, we've got a bit of sustain happening just to keep it from dying out too soon. Yeah, hear how that hi-hat is quite choppy until I turn the transient designer on. Connects each hit of the hi-hat. And then we've got the room tracks now. So I go a bit crazy with rooms, and I've got 4 different drum rooms all happening together because I love drum rooms. I think that's where you get away from the fakeness of programmed drums. So from the same drum instruments we've been using, and I like to stress not to underutilize the rooms in the drum instrument that you use. It's important, and it's going to give the drums space and stop them sounding like different samples. It makes them sound like a drum kit. So a bit of compression on my One Kit Wonder pop punk room. 4-to-1, yeah, and it's almost bringing out the snare because this is mostly about the snare in this room in particular. So attack is almost as slow as the compression that we had on the snare to bring out the transient fast release. It sounds like this. Nice room, nice snare verb, pretty much is what it's doing. Now this is the Drumforge room that's got the cymbals in it, and this gives like depth to your overheads and everything. It glues everything together and gives it sort of like a 3D feel. I've also trashed this up a bit to get it sounding pretty cool. So EQ, don't want the sub of the kick to conflict with anything, and the top end, because I'm going to distort it and compress it, I don't want that to fight with the overheads. I like where the overhead shimmer is, so I want to give it glue and body, but this would just get out of control if we didn't do this. I'm tucking them underneath the shimmer of the overheads, basically. So compression. Interesting thing I want to point out, this is in dual mono. I don't want it to be stereo because I don't want it to compress both channels when maybe a tom fill or a cymbal is happening that's mostly in left or right speaker. I want that to stay independent. Otherwise, it's going to be pulling things down, which is not a problem. It can be cool, but I didn't want that to happen with fills and stuff. This is more of an effect than a glue. So that gives us this. Start with it off and I'll turn it on. Other than the obvious level there. Let me try and compensate for that. So with it off, but I'll turn the plugin up. And now let's hear it with the compression at the same level. That's life. I'm adding life into that, getting those transients out. It's a 10-to-1, the opto setting on the distressor. Then decapitator for a bit of saturation. Again, I'm trying to give energy, a bit of bite, a bit of life to it. And then because we're doing all that stuff, soothe to keep things from going out of control. Now, these are just Logic rooms here for the toms. Again, making sure that they sound like they're in a space, so they're not just separate, sticking out toms. And then shell room, this is from Modern and Massive, which is a dry room, which is cool because I like to make sure that we've got some more of the sort of wet room sounds up here with the punk room and the Drumforge. This is dry, so you get space around your transients, basically. So all the tom rooms together sound like this. You know, and there's a lot of life in that. If I mute that, play the drums, and hear what it sounds like without the rooms. See, hear how you obviously get a tighter sound because you're adding a bit of washiness to it with the room, but you're losing that space and you're losing the realism and you're losing the glue. If we put that in the context of the whole mix, I'll turn the room off. It sounds like programmed drums to me. And then with the rooms in, depth, vibe, life, super important. So I've been over the drum bus already. This is really subtle. This is to sort of emulate hardware. It's not doing much at all. And the compression is just bus glue. Bus glue is a hard thing to define. I'll play this and what it's doing, but it is just stopping things from jumping out so that you get a cohesive sound. And then because I've got the attack set to being really slow and the release being really fast, that's why you get a bit more drive and energy out of that. That's cool. And then you probably won't hear any difference with this saturation. But I've got a saturation of some kind on every bus. So it adds up to like an analog feel at the end. It makes it sound less in the box. These multi-tracks are available on my Shopify. So if you do want to grab them and give it a go yourself, you can get them from there. And if you want to see how my typical approach to guitars is for pop punk, then you can watch this video here. So as always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you at the next one.